Hello everybody. If you could start making your way to your seats, we can get started here. Welcome, first of all. This is Rhetoric and Composition 103, and I'm very happy to see you all. As it is rhetoric, I know there are likely as many of you here by chance as there are by choice, and I hope you will give me enough of a chance to prove to you that rhetoric is not a dusty old subject. And I firmly believe that if you give me your best effort, rhetoric will not only stand to enhance your academic career, but it can be quite beneficial to your professional career, to any kind of political career you might plan, and certainly even for your social life. You may even become better at asking people out for dates. So, love and riches await. So let's get started. Before we dive in, I do need to take just a couple notes and fill out a couple forms here. And while I'm doing that, please do feel free to peruse your textbooks, as we will get down to those in just a moment. First of all, I just need a good head count here, so okay. Now, I do need to find out how many students are here for various areas of study. So if you can just raise your hand if these apply to you. How many students are here for GURs, or General University Requirements? Up, okay. You, 2, 3 of you. Okay, so those are 3 GUR students. Classics majors? Any classics majors? Okay. And classics minors? Okay. Just 2 of you. English majors? That can be writing or literature. Okay. And then English minors, again, either concentration. Okay. Do we have any late add-ons? Any students who may have added the class at the last minute within the last week? Okay. And how long was that you... About a week and a half ago? Okay, that actually should be fine. Anybody else? Late add-ons? Okay. And add-on students, could I get your student ID? Yeah, you can just come to the front and... Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, so what is your student ID? Okay, 5, 3, 7, 1, 2, 5, 8, 1. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and your student number? Okay. 3, 7, 6, 8, 1. And this one? Okay. Thank you. You can go ahead. Thanks. Okay. Do we have any students auditing the class? Not for credit, just for the wonderful experience? Okay. And auditing students, could I get your full name? Okay. Okay. Okay, and then we do have a request in this class for a note taker position. So if you feel you're good at taking notes and that you'll have fairly impeccable attendance, we can only pay $10 an hour at this point, but if any... You? Okay, could you both just come up real quick and I'll get your information? Yeah, and the rest of you can again, just continue to look at your book. It will just take one moment. Okay. Okay, so, you're interested in the note-taking position, both of you? Okay, just so you know, the notes will need to be fairly neat. You won't have to transcribe them, but your handwriting will need to be quite neat and thorough, so I'll need to see your first couple classes worth of notes, and then we can go ahead and get you approved. Both of you should be okay. All right. Can I get your name? Yeah. Okay. Spell that for me. Okay. Okay, and your student number? Great. And your email? The school email, yeah. Okay. You can go ahead and sit down. And then you? Yeah. Yeah, just your student number? Okay. And also email? Yeah. Yeah, your student email. Okay. .edu. Okay. Great. You can go sit down. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So, just so we're clear, our class does meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So, please do your best to be here. Class attendance is necessary, and you will certainly be graded on your participation. I do keep fairly consistent office hours, so please see your syllabus that you should have picked up at the door, and I have a very open door policy, so I encourage you to take advantage of that. And that looks like, let me see, yeah. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, as I've said, rhetoric may seem rather old world, but the truth of it is that rhetoric affects everything, and it is a part of all of our lives. So you may have noticed that your reading list seems a bit eclectic. That's because I like to give us a good solid foundation for classic rhetoric, as well as cultural applications and modern ideas. All right, so in addition to your texts, we will be watching at different times various speeches, debates, films, and we'll also be looking at things like video games, the stock market, and fashion runways to talk about different kinds of rhetoric and its many iterations. So I hope that will be enjoyable for you. And we first will start with some foundations. So please, even if you haven't bought all your books yet, please make sure that you have this text. You'll need it as early as next class, and this is absolutely essential. You can find many used copies. I've requested many used copies for the bookstore here on campus. And I like this copy. It's a nice weight, and it's divided up quite well. There have been a few different printings of this book. It is important, however, whichever version you do get, that you buy it and don't borrow it, because I will be asking you many times to mark it up, okay? So we'll be taking notes directly in the book, okay? And please don't get intimidated. There are going to be many phrases and tropes in here that may seem unfamiliar, but we'll work through them together, okay? So please buy your books, okay? And from there, the other books should also be available, and I would recommend getting them as soon as possible. I also will at different times be providing you with course packs, okay, so that you shouldn't have to buy too many actual texts, but this one is essential, and I think most of you will quite like it anyhow. So it is a little bit dense, this one, okay, so be prepared for that. Also, I know you may groan at the thought of Shakespeare, but Henry V is quite exciting, and we will be looking especially at some of the speeches in this one. Again, this is a used copy from the bookstore here. I would recommend picking it up since it is inexpensive, and they were able to get me many versions of this one. Okay, so it will be easiest if we all have the same edition, since we'll be looking very specifically at certain pages in here, okay? So get that one. You have a little bit more time before we start this. And the final one that I wasn't able to procure all in the same version is This Perfect Day by Ira Levin. I think you'll really enjoy this book. And this has a quite sort of cheesy sci-fi cover, so don't be thrown off by it. You know what we say about books and covers. This is a really fantastic sci-fi, and it is the only novel we'll be reading as a class, although you may, for different projects and research purposes, choose certain novels of your own. I think everyone's read the heck out of 1984, so this will give us a little bit different perspective on a similar subject matter. Okay, so those are the books. Please do get them. And with that said, we'll go ahead and dive in here. I keep all my notes in this Panda note. I wanted to see if any of you wanted to offer your own definition or understanding of rhetoric and what the essential quality of rhetoric might be. So, does anyone have any thoughts on this? Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Words are important. What we say and the way we say it, absolutely. Does anyone have an idea on what might separate classic rhetoric from from just other kinds of communication. Yes, it does not have to be. Rhetoric is not always spoken. It does largely come from an oral tradition, and we often think of it that way. But I would absolutely say you're correct. It doesn't necessarily have to be a spoken word, and we'll even explore in this class that it doesn't necessarily even have to be a written word or deliberate language necessarily, all right? But let's think about that deliberate, okay? I think that the key element of what separates rhetoric from, let's say, expression in general is the quality of intention, okay? Intention. So that means that not only are we going to be thinking about intention, as in what is the intention of our rhetor, not writer, okay? Rhetor. So when we think about intentionality, we think about the intention of our rhetor, but we also think about the intention of audience, okay? All of you here have a certain intention in what you hear and what you perceive, as I have an intention in what I'm saying to you, okay? Great. So I wanted to start with some basic definitions, and today we will be going relatively slowly. However, we will speed up fairly quickly after this, okay? So please do write all of this down. If you're having any trouble with it, please feel free to ask, okay? So when we think about rhetoric, what do we think about? Just go ahead, you can just say it, shout it out. Good, yeah. We think about persuasion, don't we? And yes, exactly. Sometimes we think about a certain amount of artifice and manipulation, which brings us to sophistry, okay? So, many of you have probably heard this word sophistry before, and it comes from a group of rhetors called the Sophists. Now, the Sophists in ancient Greece and later in Rome were a group of rhetors and teachers of rhetoric, okay? And they traveled around, and they would require pay to teach people what they believed were the tenets of rhetoric, okay? And essentially, because there was such a strong oral tradition in our ancient civilizations, if you were able to speak persuasively, you were able to garner power, okay? And so the Sophists, they peddled that, and some people thought that they were quite good at what they did, and some people took issue with what they were doing. We can think of the Sophists as a sort of pay-to-play model, we might say today. And of course there were people that believed that everybody should have access to education, language education, and perhaps people should arm themselves against sophistry, okay? And today the term is quite derogatory. It is not necessarily a compliment to be called a sophist. And if you are, you may be a bit too obvious in your approaches of persuasion, okay? And we'll talk all about them in depth, and please don't let me shape your opinions too much of the sophists, because they certainly have plenty to offer to our discussion. But there were people who took issue with this. And you may have heard of these gentlemen. Socrates. Okay. And Aristotle. Okay. So, Socrates and Aristotle, among others, were quite displeased with the sophists and with sophistry in general. Okay? And they felt that language is important, but perhaps not as important as your actual knowledge, and that wisdom was not synonymous with what we'll call today elegance. All right? So, we can think that perhaps wisdom can be expressed through elegance or eloquence, but Socrates and Aristotle feared that the sophists and others like them were spreading their brand of language arts, we'll say rhetoric. Their tactics were able to empower those without true intellect, without true knowledge, without true experience, to still sound as if they knew what they were talking about, okay? And so I'm sure if you've watched the 24-hour news cycle in this day and age, or if you've ever been on the internet, you're quite aware that just because someone says something with elegance does not necessarily make it effective. Okay, so they took a great issue with this, but they did still feel that rhetoric was worth learning. Does anyone have any ideas about why? Exactly, that's it exactly. Okay, it's well, it's sort of a way of knowing your enemy. And so if we think about rhetoric as a very powerful tool, then it would be very important to understand it, okay? So this certainly does not sum up everything about, and you'll excuse the light in here is a little difficult today. It doesn't mean that this is the sum of all of their thoughts on rhetorical philosophy. In fact, we'll be spending a great deal of time with Aristotle here, okay, to understand all of this. But it is sort of a simple way to understand a little bit of the tension in ancient times, okay, that was going on. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what is still largely the debate around rhetoric and what I would call its values and its limitations in human society, okay? So I want to make sure that before we go further, we understand just a few key terms, okay? So you will hear these terms again and again, and so it's necessary to learn them. these first three were especially important to Aristotle and can be applied to every piece of rhetoric we look at. Okay, so the first one is what we call ethos. Okay, and ethos is something you'll hear a lot of. I believe there's even a brand of bottled water called Ethos. Does anyone have an idea of what ethos might connotate? Okay, so ethos can be summed up, and perhaps too simply, as character. As character, okay? And again, my handwriting is also quite awful, and I certainly apologize for that. So ethos can be summed up as character, okay? And so when we think of ethos, we think of who our rhetor is, and that can be a person or even a corporation, a politician certainly. And this is where we come to understand, or they try to impart on us, things like their own morality, their own experience, their own wisdom. Okay, and there's many different ways to express ethos. Pathos is also one of these key modes of persuasion. Okay, and pathos is, again, something we're probably quite familiar with. Does anyone want to give us a definition? Yes, go ahead. Emotion. Fantastic. Pathos can be seen as emotion, okay? And again, these are all very, very simple definitions and ways of looking at these tropes, which we will expand upon throughout the semester. But pathos displays emotion, okay, and that can be trying to make the audience feel something for various means of persuasion, and it can even mean imparting a certain vulnerability into the way you speak or what you say. Okay, a lot of times politicians in this day and age will say, I spoke to little Jenny Sue from such and such elementary school, and she doesn't have enough money for school lunch. And, this is a very deliberate appeal to emotion. There are many kinds that we will look at, okay? And then finally, logos. Okay, and again, these are three modes of persuasion that you really, really need to understand. So, ethos, pathos, okay, and finally logos. And logos, as it sounds like logic, we can see logos as an appeal to reason, to logic, to rationality, okay? And again, that's seems quite simple to understand, but can be accomplished in many different ways, all right? So, one more that is not necessarily one of these three key appeals, but that I am quite fascinated with, and I believe we will spend a lot of time talking about, is also kairos, okay? Kairos with a K. When we can think of kairos, does anyone have a definition for kairos? That's okay. We're here to learn. So, kairos can be seen as what we might call the opportune moment, okay? So, it can also be thought of as timing. And that means that there is not only a way of expressing something, but a time and a place to do that will be most effective, and perhaps there is only one truly right moment and right chance to seize that moment, okay? So, again, I know this is sounding like a lot of stuffy terms, but I think you'll find it rather fun. Once you master some of these terms, you won't even be able to watch a newscast without detecting all of these. And like I've said again, these exist in almost every facet of communicated living, and you'll see them in everything sooner or later, and it feels a little like decoding the world around you, okay? So, now there are just a couple more topics, and one of them will come from what I hope will be one of your favorite texts. This is simulacra and simulation, okay? And we won't delve into this quite yet, but what I do want to say is simulacra is perhaps a complex idea, enormously complex, in fact, after you read this. But just to give us an idea of simulacra, simulacra could be seen as a copy without an original. Does that make sense to anyone, or does that sound just totally far out? Yes, okay, that's true. We'll get that out of the way. This book was featured in the movie franchise The Matrix. I would caution any of you using The Matrix as a source for any of your projects or papers in this class. I don't mind discussing it, but we must look beyond even the intellectual prowess of Keanu Reeves to fully understand the idea of simulacra. Okay? But The Matrix is perhaps a way of understanding that a simulacra is really a copy without the qualities of the original. Okay? And that could mean a lot of different things, and it can be taken to a lot of different levels. For example, if there was a play where a play was performed and somebody was to paint a very realistic portrait of one of the actors, and later somebody was to hang that in a museum, and then someone was to take a picture of that painting, of that play, of that person as a character, okay? We start to see that we get farther and farther away from the original. Of course, in The Matrix, there was, well, there were many examples of things that maybe had qualities of human living, but they weren't quite right, okay? So simulacra is extremely complex, but we can think of it as a copy without an original at this point, okay? So, finally, and this is something I'd like you to think about and just do a little free writing about tonight, okay? It doesn't have to be anything formal, but I would like you to think a little bit about the difference between form and content, okay? So, form is the way we say things, and content is what we say. So, if you had come into my class today and I had been quite curt and I had told you to sit down and shut up and buckle up, you might have more or less of an interest in doing well in this class. So, what I am saying is obviously not necessarily as important as how I'm saying it. And that is the very base foundation of what we're looking at, okay? So I want you to think about form and content in the world, and that doesn't just have to be in terms of language, okay? If you even want to think about the difference in automobiles, okay, what the car actually does and what the car actually looks like. You may have noticed more and more cars are looking sportier and sportier once again after the recession, and they have a lot of fake details, such as fake venting, okay, or certain kinds of aerodynamics that would imply a need for downforce. If you're interested in cars, it might be fun to think about something like that. On the other end, if you're interested in something like fashion, you might think about something like an A-line dress, okay? And let me see if I can show you a little bit about what I'm talking about here. My board will be just a little bit messy. So, if we were to think about women's fashion after World War II, okay, and my dress is a small example of what an A-line might look like, okay? So, we have a dress that, a dress that comes in at the middle and goes out a little bit here, okay? And it creates a little bit of a line. What you might not know is that if we think about an A-line dress, just say A-line, okay? So it looks a little bit like the letter A. After World War II, it became very popular to be fit here at the waist and then really, really exaggerate that A-line and come out. Does anybody know why? Okay. The reason for this? Yes, that is a good point. It is certainly flattering to the waist. It makes the waist look cinched and small, and it creates a nice waist to hip ratio, which is a key to attraction if you ask a lot of scientists. However, the main reason for doing this was because families and women who ran households had been, sorry about that, women who ran households had been rationing for a very long time, okay? And rationing meant that there wasn't very much fabric to go around. So after the war, a renewed age of prosperity came about, and women were suddenly able to afford extra fabric for their clothes. Okay, so this was not only a way of saying, I look feminine, I look pretty. This was a way of saying, we have won. Okay, so these may seem sort of silly, but I encourage you to really, really look through this book tonight. Again, we don't have assigned reading from this particular text for a few days. However, if you'll go through, you will see that this book includes ideas about all kinds of different things, okay? And you'll sort of see that listed here. It talks about things like the Holocaust. It talks about Vietnam. It talks about the media, marketing. It talks about cloning and holograms, okay? So it gets quite futuristic at times. It talks about, like I said, the stock market. It talks about archaeology. It talks about religion, iconography, and it talks quite a bit about ethics, animal rights issues. Okay, so all kinds of things here. And so what I would recommend is just going through the book. Okay, just flip through the book and look for words that appeal to you. Okay, here we talk even about Disneyland. His thoughts on Disneyland are exquisite and fascinating. Okay, so just let things jump out at you. We go from talking about Disneyland here to talking about Watergate and political scandal. Okay? So, it's quite exciting. Communism, art, theater. So, go through and pick out things that apply to you or that interest you, and just meditate on them. I'm again not asking for any kind of formal writing. You may choose to enjoy his arguments about television, and this is television. It's a very obvious example, okay, of simulated reality. So I want you to start thinking about those and stretching your mind past the point of just language to understanding that rhetoric is an essential part of all communication. And communication is in more places than you think, okay? So think about that. Think about form and content. And again, I'll write it down one more time since it's so very important. Under my lovely picture of a dress. That looks like more like a flipper, like someone's going scuba diving, so I apologize. One more time though, let's think about intention. Okay, that whether or not this is done on an extremely conscious level, or whether we might go down into depths of the subliminal, intention is essential. Okay, so, and then you'll notice in your syllabus a very short reading in that first book by Aristotle. It's just a little bit of an introduction, and that will hopefully get you acquainted. Okay, so I'm going to let you go a little bit early today because today was just a good chance for us to meet, and I will stay after class for a few minutes in case anyone has any concerns or questions. Otherwise, I look forward to reading your meditations and seeing you again very, very shortly, okay? So, thank you so much, and we'll see you next class.